Welcome to the Audit, presented by IT Audit Labs. I'm your co-host and producer, Joshua Schmidt. Today we're joined by Eric Brown and Nick Mellum, the usual suspects. And today our guest is Tim Herman from InfraGard. Tim, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you know Eric, and tell us what you do at InfraGard?
Sure. I am the president of InfraGard Minnesota. I live here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and InfraGard, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a FBI private sector partnership. Essentially, 85% of the nation's critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and so the FBI wants to have relationships with those business leaders, and we've got about 800 members in Minnesota. Of those 800 members, I would say probably 90% of them are leaders in an IT role, a CISO and other leadership roles.
I'm proud to say I'm a member.
Yes.
And Tim, I apologize. The first thing you hear is, that Josh is sleeping in the middle of the day.
Sleeping on the job.
He's napping. Like, we don't have enough to do around here.
Because you're up late.
Yeah, well, aren't we all up late?
Right.
It's a life of a musician, fellas. Life of a musician.
Yes.
Yeah, when you guys are all getting tucked into your beds, I'm going to be playing Mustang Sally down at the bar. So,
oh, nice.
Unless there's a breach, just like the meme.
Yeah. We're speaking of which, stick around to the end, folks. We got meme of the day. We're going to pop that up here at the end of the convo. So stick around to the end. You're not going to want to miss this meme that Nick pushed to me via the algorithms of LinkedIn.
When I was up late and working all day.
It happens. There's a lot of sickness going around right now. A lot of itis.
A lot of excuses.
Okay, Eric coming in looking like Darth Maul today with the looks like he's you're Dark Eric today, I think.
Yeah, put the hood up, please.
There you go. Dark Eric.
That completed the look.
That's awesome.
Before we jump into the whole other thing, Tim, what is the thought process behind the FBI pushing this to the private sector? Is there like a quick skinny that you can give the listeners and me,
Sure.
like why they would do that?
Sure. So the mission of InfraGard is to help protect our nation's critical infrastructure. So the basis is there are 16 areas of critical infrastructure. So IT being one of them, transportation, energy, dams, water treatment facilities. So this makes up several of those critical infrastructure sectors. The reason the FBI gets brought in on investigations and things in the cyber attack world is because they're the ones that are hunting down the bad actors, and a lot of times they actually have the encryption keys to from other investigations. So rather than paying a ransom, if you bring the FBI in, it's very possible that they might have the keys to to unlock the kingdom as well. And so the FBI, they're not interested in your secret sauce. They just want to help in any way they can on that investigative side.
Eric, can you speak a little bit about your experience working with Tim, or is there anything that we can't talk about there? Or
no, Tim and I, maybe it's been a little less than a year or so, but certainly have appreciated working with Tim. And Tim's got a lot of great contacts in the industry. Tim's helped, and maybe Tim, this is a story you could tell around some of the, what would we call it, like the tabletop exercises that you've participated in. Cool stories there, and just bringing together like a great group of people in Minnesota that all care about information security, either at a conference or at the meetups that you do. And you do those meetups quarterly, is it, Tim?
5 times a year, actually. And, the interesting thing about that is we just had our chapter meeting this last Monday. And, we had about 65. Yeah, we had about 65 people that showed up. We're now meeting at Medtronic's headquarters. One of the cool things about that particular meeting is we brought in a speaker from the U.S. Coast Guard that helped facilitate a tabletop exercise a few years back on the upper Mississippi River that engaged the City of St. Paul Port Authority and the City of St. Paul Emergency Management and a host of others. And so if you want to get into that in more detail, I can share a little bit more about that as well.
Yes, definitely.
I would love
I
that.
want to get into the details about where it was on my calendar because it's not here.
You need a new assistant.
Yes, we definitely want to get into the tabletop exercises and some of the groundwork you've been doing, Tim. But can you give us kind of just a general, 30,000 foot view of like why tabletop exercises are so critical with the private sector and infrastructure, critical infrastructure?
So a few years ago, I worked for an organization called Norwich University Applied Research Institutes, and they actually were using Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate funding to develop an exercise platform to do tabletop exercises all throughout areas of that critical infrastructure. And so when I was working for them is when I worked with the Coast Guard and helped kind of organize that exercise on the upper Mississippi River. But why tabletops are really important is most companies of a certain scale or a certain size have developed an incident response plan. And Eric, I know that you work with companies on helping them create that incident response plan. It's great to have a plan, but if you don't actually test the plan and exercise the plan, you don't really know how you're going to do in a real world incident. And so to just like in the military does drills and drills and drills, you need to exercise and build that muscle memory so that you not only eliminate the silos between the different people that would need to be engaged in a real world incident, but you develop those those relationships between each other so that again when things go sideways, you're actually able to have that muscle memory and respond accordingly.
I think a lot of times when we've been doing these exercises, a lot of people they're scared to pull the hood up and see what could go wrong when we should be practicing this so much we can't get it wrong.
Yeah.
And when I was in the military, I had it was a sergeant at the time. He would always tell us the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war.
Right.
So if we continue to practice this day in and day out and help these organizations understand that we can be comfortable being uncomfortable to make sure we get these things right when it's a real life.
Well, and what I was always trying to share with folks when I'm kind of organizing a tabletop exercise is there's no right or wrong answer to to going through an exercise. There's no bad bad way to do an exercise, or it's not about singling out people that did something wrong. It's really more about identifying where your gaps are and so that you're not stuck winging it when you're in the middle of a crisis.
In my line of work, tabletop exercises means something completely different. But I'm curious have you worked with Eric on a tabletop exercise before together or?
Not yet, but we should.
We need to. Yeah, that'd be fun.
I know, Eric, you have some experience with tabletop as well. What does your experience look like working with organizations to run these kinds of exercises?
It's a time when you get the leaders of the organization in a room and they're not politicking or worried about their individual areas of responsibility. So it's kind of a unique view where they come in and you have people from you could have leadership overseeing HR or communications, and then the more tactical roles as well. And you're going through essentially a role-playing scenario, right? An exercise. Homeland Security will come into organizations and help out with them. It's really a nice way to see how the organization works. And it helps the organization understand what maybe some of the other roles that they may not see, right? They may just see the security organization as pushing out these crazy phishing emails once a month, but then to actually see how the security organization works in real time and not in a real crisis, that there's stress. There is a little stress on the tabletop because you're like uncovering these gaps in the organization of like, oh, well, who does get to push the button, which is something that Chris Gabbard, when he leads these from Homeland Security, it really drives the leaders to say who can make that call to take that production system offline. So it's just a great 2 hours to a half a day experience.
We need more button pushers.
One of the things that was really cool about the exercise on the Mississippi River was when I first started working for this organization, the Nuwari Research Institute. I reached out to the St. Paul Port Authority, and knowing that they run everything on the Upper Mississippi River, and then they said, you know what, you really need to talk to the port operator, and the person that the group that's actually moving all the barges around. And so I met with them, and right away he identified, hey Tim, a couple of years ago, we actually put in all new engines in our tugboats that are all remotely controlled. So our drivers don't even have to be on the boat, and so now we're moving 8 or 12 barges around with a joystick essentially. And their concern is we don't have a what if plan for if somebody were to remotely hijack that and run it into another boat or into a bridge or the refinery down the river or whatever the case is. And so this exercise ended up turning into more of a workshop on identifying who needs to be involved in that scenario if something like that were to happen in the real world. The outcome of that is they've actually been able to continue doing exercises. And so I think they've done at least 1 or 2 additional exercises to be able to now exercise that incident response plan and still finding additional gaps and building that muscle memory.
So did you do well at game night last time we had at IT Audit Labs with this tactical kind of thinking? Because I had to leave a little bit earlier, and Eric was nice enough to text me the outcome of the game, but I think it was blood on the clock tower or something like that.
Yeah. I was actually the demon in that one, and so I lived through it all.
I just remember being slightly persecuted, kind of not too much unlike the beginning of this episode. I was kind of the patsy or the pariah of that game early on, but I was I think I was just a townsperson or something.
It's always a poor Josh. Poor Josh. Going back to the tabletop exercise with the 3-letter agencies that Josh was just talking about, I'm curious, when you get all these big entities together, how, let's say you finish the tabletop exercise, how do you, uncover all these gaps, things that they're doing right or wrong, things they could do better? How do you get all of them to marry together and listen and get on the same sheet of music and start to implement these things? Because I would assume once you do it, the job's not done.
Right, absolutely. So every exercise will finish up with what's called an after action report. And actually right after the exercise is closed, you want to spend at least 30 minutes in what's called a hot wash, where you're just heat of the moment. What was your experience like? What did you learn? While you're still kind of amped up and in that exercise mode, and then you spend the next couple of weeks drafting that after action report, and that's the how to to fix what we learned. Doing one exercise isn't enough. You actually have to have an exercise program where you're doing exercises maybe twice a year or quarterly, or it depends on your business and how things change in your business. But there are some organizations that are doing it quarterly and some organizations that are doing it only every other year. And again, it just depends on the business. But that exercise program really helps identify where again, it's a measuring stick. You're measuring how good did we do in identifying additional gaps, or how good did we do in being ready and building that muscle memory.
Eric, how have you seen this shore up the security with the people that you've worked with when conducting tabletop exercises?
The thing that resonates most with me is you're able to show value and get some funding for information security programs and the outcome of this. Because, going into it, some of the leadership doesn't quite really know what we do on a day-to-day basis. And then, during the exercise, when you have multiple things going on and you're talking through those scenarios and they see how important information security is, the next time the budget cycle rolls around, there's not as much pushback, right? Are we going to get new tables and chairs, or are we going to invest in information security?
The shipping on the Mississippi River. Any other Tom Cruise worthy kind of incidents that we could go over? Because we're all action junkies. We want to hear the good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give an example of we did a exercise with a couple of different airports around the U.S. And the interesting part that we learned is every airport, and this is not unlike other businesses and other sectors, but every airport is in a different maturity level, and so that exercise can go deeper, or it plays really basic or not basic, but more attuned to the people that are in the room, that might not be all your technical people. It might just be your leadership. It might be the CIO and the CISO and the CEO and kind of all that C-suite, but then also include legal and include the marketing person, that it handles all the communications. And when there is a real world scenario, you've got to be on your tippy toes, ready to go, because things can go even more sideways, very quickly.
One common trend that I feel like I'm always seeing is communication. But as soon as when things kick off, and still, part of communication, everybody starts running into each other. Yeah. And it's like the Spider-Man meme, like they're pointing at each other, like, I thought you were doing that. No, I thought you were doing that. Yeah. So I think just getting everybody to slow down. This is why we're training. So, take a breath, regroup for a second. Maybe it's still going to be uncomfortable, really, no matter what, right? So if we can get it from being like 75 or 80% clunky, let's get it down to like 20 or 30. We're more streamlined. You have a good basis to get you far down the track, and then you can keep building on it. But the communication is usually the biggest piece, whether that's social media, the press, newsletters, whatever it is. How to communicate that and when.
You could take, if you have a P2 or a P1 incident that's going on in an organization where you have multiple systems that are down or a critical system that's down, and you're going through, you could even do it in the event of, say, a planned outage, a maintenance window. So your firewall's down and you have multiple teams testing. You have some people on the business side that are going to be involved in testing, and then you have your central communication channel, you have your technical channel. You could really run these as a tabletop exercise, do the hot wash after, talk about it, and write it up. Because I've been involved in a few of these recently where there's a scheduled outage window between a certain time, and then the technical people are bothering the engineer who's hands-on configuring, say, the firewall. Firewall's got to come up within an hour or we're going to be behind schedule. And they're saying, can we test yet? Can we test yet? Pinging him because they have a direct relationship with that engineer, versus leveraging the channel and the project manager who's, coordinating that and will handle the communication. So being able to then go back to the organization and talk about it, it's really the tabletop exercises are more so aimed at the leadership level. But these using a P1 or a P2 or even an outage window where you have engineers like that help desk person who's going to be taking those calls during the outage, instead of escalating that to the engineers, they could just stop the communication right there. So yes, we're in an outage window. We'll have a communication for you at X time, versus then having to trouble the engineers with, when is it going to be back up?
Yeah, that's totally true. One company that I was consulting with through my employer, they wanted to do two separate exercises. One for the leadership to help identify, kind of where gaps might be in the leadership, but then they wanted to do a technical exercise that focused on really, okay, we know that if our systems get encrypted and locked in, we actually need to migrate other systems to the cloud, and we need to make sure that that's going to be seamless. And so let's exercise that process, so we're not having to do that in the real world. One of the things that I always would ask the people that I was working with on the client side is, what are you really trying to accomplish? rather than just saying, hey, we want to exercise a ransomware, event. My answer to that is why. What is it that you really want to get out of that? Is that a concern of yours? Why is that a concern? What are those concerns? And really kind of dive deep into, because when you're creating a scenario for an exercise, you want that scenario to actually be relevant and not too generic. That's just another layer that you need to be part of.
Tim, I can't tell you how many organizations I've walked into and I've said, "Are you backing up your M360 Vive environment?"
Yeah.
Oh no, we don't have to do that. Microsoft does that. What?
Right.
Good luck.
Yeah, what? Because if somebody fat fingers something, somebody maliciously deletes something, you're not getting it back, right?
Insider threat, all kinds of things.
Microsoft is responsible at the zone level of, if they wipe something out, they're gonna take care of getting it back, but they don't care about your data. That's your problem.
Right. Well, the thing that we always tell people also, and I'm sure that you've shared this with your clients and people that you work with, is that make sure that your incident response plan is not on your same system, that on your hard drives or in the cloud, because you should have a hard copy of it, because if it's encrypted, you don't actually have a playbook then. And if a bad actor is in your network for 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years before they actually decide to execute said disruption, they actually have read through your incident response plan. They know who your insurance company is. They know who your legal law firm is. They know exactly where to hit you because they've read your incident response plan. So there's just having a plan isn't the ball game. It's knowing how to use the plan and where things need to be put as well.
That threat actor probably knows your incident response plan better than your organization does.
Yeah, right.
And having that back channel, if you're a team shop, you've got Slack as a channel, or Discord, or some way to communicate if you can't get into your work systems.
Exactly.
That is an interesting point, Eric. I don't think enough people are putting pressure on having another means of communication, right? They just think Teams is always going to be up, or whatever their means of communication will always be there, but having a secondary or tertiary to ensure communication, it's a big deal.
So sometimes that's fun to do too. If you go into an organization, you're doing a tabletop, and they're a little bit, maybe they've been through a few of these before, and they're pretty good. They've got a good plan. Then you say, okay, well, now you can't use your cell phone, right? Something happened in the area. You got a regional disruption. Cell towers are out, right? Like the AT&T issue that happened 2 years ago, where cell phone coverage was disrupted because allegedly they messed up a DNS entry or something, whatever it was. But then, how are you gonna get a hold of Nick, right? How are you gonna get a hold of Tim or Josh if you can't call them? What are you gonna do?
We got to have everybody's got to go out and get their ham radio license.
Or if I'm napping, for example.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we can count on Josh being napping during this whole situation.
I turn my ringer off.
Do not disturb. He's asleep. Yeah.
1 o'clock on a Friday.
He's doing some research on aliens or something.
Well, yeah, of course.
Tim, I tell you, this dude. Yeah, where's the tinfoil, Nick?
we keep tinfoil hats on handy.
Speaking of which, got a tinfoil hat question.
The production value here at IT Audit Labs.
Here's the tinfoil hat question of the day, Tim. So a lot of planes have been going down, helicopters lately. I mean, was it just a couple of years ago, the Baltimore Bridge incident? Yeah. Does this set off your spider senses at all? Do you feel like these could be cyber attack related, or at least some of them? Some of them are probably just user error, of course. But once again, this is a tinfoil hat question. So
I cannot confirm or deny. No. I have to say, honestly, anytime I hear that, T-Mobile is down again, or some other thing has a major outage, in the back of my mind, I wonder if it's some kind of a breach, some kind of a scenario that, or an incident, if you will, that might be going on. And the thing is you're not going to hear about it in the public, for another 6 months, because they've got to do the forensics and they've got to do a bunch of things, making sure that they're back up and running. And they need to identify, was their data lost? Was data compromised? And so, there's just a whole lot of things that need to happen before you can, share with the public. But yeah, I would say, that tinfoil hat, with things kind of going sideways, it is something that I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Is that even a possibility to hack into a airplane or a helicopter's system and control it? Or, I mean, you said that it's possible for like remote controlled boats or barges, right?
Well, how many drones do you think there are going around in the world that's all remote controlled? It's
Yeah, that's a great question.
yeah, absolutely. I think it's possible.
When there is a new threat that does pop up on our radar, how fast are we to incorporate these things into your tabletop exercises? Do you get your clients on the horn right away and set up a meeting, or do these things kind of depend on how the organization wants to prioritize this part of their security?
It's certainly something. It's certainly something that you're aware of, and you've got your client list. Say if you're doing a virtual CISO, with a healthcare client or with some kind of business in manufacturing, and some new scenario comes up or comes to mind, and or something happens in the marketplace that is relevant. Yeah, absolutely. You want to reach out to your clients and make sure that that's incorporated. Getting back to the exercises that we were doing with the short line and regional railroads, an interesting fact about that is there are 500 short line railroads in the United States. And of those 500, probably 90% of them use the same piece of software to manage, not just, kind of their operations, but manage the switching of the tracks. And so what happens if that software gets compromised? You essentially screech to a halt the entire transportation, rail transportation in the United States. And so, how prepared are you for something like that to happen? And that was, part of the scenario for those exercises.
And we saw that with, was it Maersk with shipping, like back in 2017, 2018 with the worm? And as we're talking through this, I'm reminded of, the other day took a picture standing out my patio window looking into the backyard, and there's the backyard is, there's a little bit of grass, and then it goes to these pine trees, and the pine trees are, let's say, maybe 30 to 40 feet tall. They're about, they're pretty mature, maybe 50, 40 years. And some of them have fallen over. We've had some removed, they died, cut them down, had them removed. But there was one that hadn't been removed. It still had some green on the top, but like you could see that the middle part was dead, right? The bark was coming off of it. And it was like, oh, we're moving here in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Is this something we're going to deal with? And probably, we'll kick the can, right? And we had a bad storm, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, and that tree fell over and it snapped off maybe 8 feet up. And fortunately, the way it fell away from the house. So I took a picture of that because it's for me, it was very poignant of the conversations that we like to have with customers of, if you work with us before you even build the house, we're gonna tell you about that your risk, right? You put a house there, you're gonna have to deal with these trees. Unfortunately, we usually get brought in after the tree has already fallen over and done damage to the house, and now we got a lot of cleanup to do, right? You're going to be displaced, your pets could have got loose, and it's a whole mess. But it's a whole mess that could have been avoided. So when maybe you built the house there, you wanted the area, you understood the risk of the trees, you signed off on the risk, but now the trees are dying, you need to take care of that tree. That's a $500 to $800 problem if you take care of that tree, before it falls. But if it falls, and it's not 100% that it's going to hit the house, but there's a good chance it could. That's a multi-$1,000 problem. That's an insurance problem, and it's in the tabletop exercises. I'm working with a client now. They're looking at doing some manufacturing in the United States, and I'm thinking about, well, where should we put that manufacturing facility, like we got to take into account transportation, right? If it's on the coast, maybe it's easier to get to. But then there's also the component of, well, if you put, they're not talking about this, but let's say they are, we're going to put manufacturing down in Florida somewhere. Well, easy to get to from flights, but that thing's going to be underwater. So just thinking through these things early and having a tabletop, even maybe before you made a decision of like, hey, we're gonna build an office building in XYZ location. Folks like, Tim and Nick and I could come in and have those conversations around like, okay, are you near, an airport, or, what are the weather patterns in that area? What are some of the things that you should really be mindful of, right? Are you putting it near a refinery? Well, what happens if that refinery has a spill? It may not impact you, but your workers may not be able to get to the office for a week until they clean that stuff up.
So to rephrase my previous question, I think what I was actually trying to get at, you kind of uncovered here. And Eric, I really liked your analogy with the trees. How do you plan for those X factors? Like you mentioned, Tim, the pandemic wasn't on anyone's bingo card for 2020. How do you plan for those contingencies that you're kind of unseen?
You really try to curveball as much of the unforeseens. Depending on the maturity of your organization, there are times where we would actually inject into the exercise some major curveball that would actually stress your people out even more. So not just that you are having this outage or downtime or whatever the scenario is, but now you've also got a strike happening at the same time, or now you've got your principal person, the CISO, happens to be on a remote island somewhere that that his laptop got pop spilled on it, and he doesn't have access to it, and like what happens in those kinds of real scenarios, because those things do happen. And so I think just trying to be creative. People like Eric, people like the company I work for, it's really just trying to understand what all the possibles are. Then you can start thinking of the impossibles, or the what are the things that are just seem so unreal. Well, let's actually inject that into the exercise just to see how people respond, and are they ready for those curveballs in the middle of a crisis.
The only question I had, Tim, was how did I not know about Monday?
Maybe they ended up in your filter.
Man, I got to go back.
Too much security.
Never too much security for the cyber attack cat here.
So next time in May, Eric, we need to have you actually come and speak in May, on May 19th, and so that way you have to show up.
Then I got to show up. I would love to. Yeah, let's do it.
You just let me know, Tim. I'll make sure it gets on the calendar.
Yeah, May 19th.
All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Tim. We've been listening to Tim Herman from InfraGard, and joined by Eric Brown and Nick Mellum of IT Audit Labs. My name is Joshua Schmidt, co-host and producer. Here's our meme of the day. And thanks again for listening. Please tell your friends, subscribe, and leave us a comment in the comment section on YouTube, or give us a review on Spotify. And we publish every other week on Monday. We'll see you soon.
You have been listening to The Audit, presented by IT Audit Labs. We are experts at assessing risk and compliance while providing administrative and technical controls to improve our clients' data security. Our threat assessments find the soft spots before the bad guys do, identifying likelihood and impact, while our security control assessments rank the level of maturity relative to the size of your organization. Thanks to our devoted listeners and followers, as well as our producer, Joshua J Schmidt, and our audio-video editor, Cameron Hill. You can stay up to date on the latest cybersecurity topics by giving us a like and a follow on our socials, and subscribing to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you source your security content.